Hi, good morning to my former colleagues and friends. Thanks to IPI and to PGA LabJack for allowing me to convey this message through a video, since I cannot make it to New York due to a conflicting commitment. You are going to be discussing the conclusions of the work of this group of external advisors called by PGA LabJack to support him during this year. You have seen for sure the document, and you will have the opportunity to dwell into more details through the friends and colleagues that are present there. I want to emphasize only two aspects. First, this was a creative, personal initiative by PGA LabJack to call on a group of people who know the UN, who care about the UN, who understand the intrinsicies of the UN, to support him as a sounding board and to provide different perspectives on issues that he felt were important to put before us. This was very important, and I believe it was an enriching experience for all of us, and hopefully it also enriched the views of PGA. But secondly, I think that this, which was a personal initiative, should be considered under a different light. We should think about how to institutionalize such an initiative so that PGAs that take on board a one-year responsibility, which is broad, is difficult, that has issues of a very, very different nature, can resort to a group of people who, as I said, not only care, but do not have a vested interest to promote an issue in a certain direction. My sense is that there is value to think about this idea. There is value to consider the experience of this year, and that's what you're going to be doing today. So I look forward to seeing the conclusions of your deliberations. I wish you an excellent deliberation. I want to thank again IPI for this opportunity. And finally, and most importantly, I want to thank PGA LabJack for offering me the chance to participate. Thank you all. All the best.
I just want to make one point. When it comes to the relationship between the public and those at the top, look at what happens there, and it's something which, in my view, as a former journalist, not enough of those at the top realize how they can access now to people on YouTube and elsewhere, doing that on an iPhone or a Galaxy or something. And that's a real big change, and I come from an era when there was film and there was tape. Now it's a very different era, and I just don't think that enough is done. When it comes to a stronger United Nations and a stronger General Assembly, it's also about stronger government and governance in many locations. That's a personal comment, but that indicates, look at the quality of it, look at the immediacy of it, look at the fact that she can do that in 3 minutes from her office or whatever without having to spend 3 days on a plane. That is a big change, and it's important when it comes to access. So let me go to the President of the General Assembly to make a few opening remarks about a stronger General Assembly and a stronger United Nations.
Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the first panel, and I'm sure the second one will be equally interesting. It's called A Stronger General Assembly for a Stronger United Nations, and believe me, I've learned something about the General Assembly during this last year, not only from chairing or presiding over the General Assembly sessions, and we have had 112 as of today, and there will be a couple of more, and I've presided over more than 70 of them, but also, and I would say mostly, thanks to many, many meetings I had with representatives of member states. I had more than 440 meetings of this nature. What have I learned about the General Assembly, or what's my perspective of the General Assembly? I would stress 3 points. First, it is an equal playing field. That means once inside the General Assembly, every country has the same votes, no matter their power, wealth, or size. And as Prime Minister Patriot Balsemao said that we are equals, but there are more equals not in the General Assembly. We are all the same in the General Assembly, and it's up to each country how agile, active and creative they are to use the same footing. The second point is that the General Assembly is the place where anything can be discussed. So General Assembly can put any issue on its agenda. The agenda is very flexible, and looking back, you see that it has dealt with climate change, with development issues, with humanitarian issues, with issues of peace, with issues of human rights, and so on and so forth. So that means there is no limit for the General Assembly on what to put on its agenda. And third, it's also a global source of checks and balances, because the fact is that we have 193 viewpoints of different countries, making sure that the Assembly is focusing on issues that are important and relevant for this planet. There is no doubt General Assembly is probably the most legitimate international body, the most legitimate voice in this world, not necessarily the most efficient. Obviously, deliberations among the 193 are not always easy and simple, but the legitimacy is unquestionable. Looking back at this 72nd session, very briefly, what are the major achievements? The number one for me is the agreement on the text of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. First ever multilateral framework addressing the issue of migration. It is yet to be adopted formally in December in Morocco, but the fact that 192 member states were able to agree on these documents means a lot. Second, I believe we managed to give attention and prominence to peace, and particularly the prevention of conflicts, which I believe is the essence of diplomacy. If we are unable to protect peace, then we can give up and leave our work to the military people. And we organized a high-level event dedicated to peace in April, which was the highlight of the system, because we've dedicated a lot of our time and effort investing and promoting the issue. And as a matter of fact, my team put together a book which is dedicated to the peace agenda during the 72nd session. Some copies are available here, and you are free to take them with you. If anyone holds the copy, if you could just show to the public. Yes, that's the book. But there are more. If you are interested, you please contact my office, and we will gladly share the book with you. The third highlight is the promotion of Sustainable Development Agenda. Needless to say, it's the key agenda for this planet and for this humanity. And we were trying to focus on issues where we need to do better. And here I want to mention in particular financing and need to bring in additional financial resources, because the usual ones, such as official development assistance, state budgets, are clearly not sufficient. So I've organized a high-level event with the assistance of my advisors in June, focusing exactly on these issues. And fourthly, this General Assembly session was very much about reforms. So we have struggled to move forward the effort to reform the Security Council. We are now finalizing the reform of the General Assembly, the process that is called revitalization. And this is the process that produced transparent selection of the current Secretary General, transparent selection of the next President of the General Assembly. But we also processed 3 reform proposals submitted by the Secretary General: peace and security reform, UN development system reform, and management reform. And General Assembly delivered on all these. So these are, without going further into details, these are the 4 major achievements as I see them as a president. Now, let us talk about how we can make a General Assembly even stronger, because the stronger General Assembly makes a stronger United Nations. And how do we see the future role of the General Assembly? Because it is the most representative international body, but how to make it also the most relevant international body. And this is what I really hope our panelists will help us to provide answers to this question. So I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Just before you leave the microphone, can I just ask you, have you seen significant change in your time in terms of process or anything else which we should bear in mind as we address this?
One of the issues I feel very strongly is that regardless of all the excellent means of communication, we don't communicate. And we have less and less dialogue, and dialogue is, again, as I said, our working tool number one. So I've addressed this issue several times, and then someone told me, if you feel so strongly, why don't you do something? And we've introduced a morning dialogue series, informal meetings with permanent representatives on issues that are relevant but are not duplicating the formal agenda of the United Nations General Assembly. We held 14 of them, and I was astonished by the strong positive reactions from the permanent representatives. The dialogues were extremely intense, very, very complex, very competent, and produced a number of excellent ideas. So it shows that there is a feeling that we need more dialogue.
And were they acting on instructions, or were they...
No. That's the beauty. They were acting in their individual capacities under Chatham House rules, but it was a free-flowing discussion, very competent, and what I'm very pleased is that the process of the revitalization of the General Assembly now formalized the morning dialogues. There is a paragraph requesting my successor to continue with this format, and the fact that there is a quest for dialogue and there is a high-level interest among the permanent representatives to engage in these informal meetings where relevant issues are discussed is a very strong positive sign.
And what impact has that had on process? And when you say that there's a stiff assembly, there's a paradox here, isn't there?
Yeah, it does have, and it may have even stronger impact on the processes, because this is exactly how you can unblock the processes that are stuck. So you get out of the official formal meeting room, you sit down and you talk. Why do we get stuck? Why can't we get more progress and better results? And this is how you can really help to answer the questions or unlock the processes which is impossible to do in formal settings when you are acting under instructions.
Fascinating. Let's hope that's endured. But I wanted to ask the President that because that will underpin some of the perceptions that maybe you've got, because of course this does happen under Chatham House rules, and therefore presumably nothing is said about it.
Nothing is said about it, but we are issuing a book, and we actually already produced a book. It's a fascinating book. It's a book that has lots of pictures that show the power of dialogue, because the pictures are taken when the PRs don't pay attention. And you see how deeply engaged they are in the dialogue. And second, the book contains the best quotes. So it's full of ideas, not lengthy text, but many, many quotes on many relevant issues. I love the book. We are going to present it, we are sending it out to the delegations this week. And I'm sure you will love it the moment you see it.
And did anyone violate confidences behind your closed door?
Not that I know.
Thank you very much. Well,
Thank you.
Please. Right, let me introduce the three more of our advisors. Hamina Mohammed, please come up and join us. Cabinet Secretary for Education in Kenya, former Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs, and former Kenyan Perm Rep to the United Nations. Let me also introduce Antonio Patriota, welcome, His Excellency Ambassador of Brazil to Italy, who very kindly looked after us very well when we had to meet in Rome, which was very tough. Former Foreign Minister of Brazil and former Perm Rep of Brazil to the United Nations. And finally, Carlos Lopez, Professor at the University of Cape Town and former Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And Carlos, you must be delighted that it's raining outside, given where you came from and how little water there is in your reservoirs at the moment. So see this again as a conversation. If you can, the microphones will be here, but let us hear first of all from Amina.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking the President of the General Assembly for the opportunity that he gave all of us to serve. It was a privilege, and I truly enjoyed working with all of you. and especially the president whose leadership and wisdom is second to none. So thank you very much for the opportunity that you gave us. Now, I am a multilateralist, and therefore for me the General Assembly is probably one of the only organs of the United Nations that has the legitimacy and the credibility to drive change. I think you heard what others said about the need for concern and the fact that we are all kind of worried about the turn that international discourse, or the lack of it, is actually taking. And that's why I think the role of the General Assembly and the elected leaders, both the President of the General Assembly and the Secretary General of the United Nations, are so critical, because they're the only bodies, and the GA especially, that brings all of us together. It allows us to think together, it allows us to make decisions together. Everybody is seated around the decision-making table, even though obviously some have more say than others, but at least it creates a much more level playing field than other organs, and specifically than the Security Council. And that's why I think that it should be continuously, not just a revitalized one, but it has to be continuously revitalized. It has to be continuously strengthened. It has to be continuously reformed, so that it can take into account, obviously, the new challenges that face the international community and provide answers to them. And how can we actually do that? First of all, it has done an incredibly wonderful job so far. And I think the president has told us what he was able to achieve in 1 year, right? If we were to go back a few years, you'd find that apart from climate change and obviously the SDGs, there are other milestones in the work of the General Assembly. And the milestones were achieved basically because this is the only avenue that we have for proper dialogue, negotiation, discourse, and decision-making that is acceptable to everybody, because everybody is actually part of it. And therefore, their thoughts, their ideas, their concerns, their challenges, and the opportunities are actually explored together. So how do we then strengthen this body even further, although we all know that it has actually done an incredible job? First of all, we must allow it to actually realize its mandate. It must fulfill this comprehensive mandate that it has without a challenge and with adequate resources. Because without resources, it doesn't matter what wonderful ideas, what wonderful programs the General Assembly actually comes up with, they will not be fulfilled, they will not be achieved. And the President has referred to the SDGs and the need to make sure that they're actually properly resourced. Otherwise, like many others, they will remain a pipe dream. And so we need to resource them. We need to provide the space that the General Assembly needs to actually realize its mandate. And it has a much more comprehensive mandate than any other organ in the United Nations. But again, because of mandate creep, right? Some of the work that should be done by the General Assembly has actually been taken over by other organs. And I'll just talk about, issues that relate to women in conflict, for instance, children in conflict, which should actually be addressed, to my mind, in the General Assembly, where the countries that are affected by conflict are actually present. And decisions should not be made by the few that sit in the Security Council without taking fully into account, the concerns, the ideas, and obviously the solutions that these countries that are faced with conflict can bring to the table. And especially since you're talking about the women and the youth, the women and youth in conflict. Yeah. And so I think that one of the things that we actually must do, and that we must all stand up to, is ensuring that the GA's mandate is not stolen. Stolen because an issue either creates a lot of limelight and people want to be part of that, or it touches very, very sensitively on some of the actions that have been taken by those in the Security Council, and so maybe an attempt to even cover up some of the actions that or the things that have happened in the battlefield. And so, and I think it demands, because this is again full membership organ, it demands all of us to actually safeguard and to build a firewall around the mandate of the General Assembly. There has to be much better communication, I think, between the elected officials and those that have appointed themselves to certain positions. And so the President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, much more communication with the Security Council, but also the General Assembly, not the Security Council, the General Assembly with the regional organizations. Because the Security Council, to a certain extent, is already engaging with regional organizations. But the General Assembly is not effectively engaging with regional organizations, because I think that would actually enrich the work of the General Assembly. What else needs to be done? Maybe have a team led by the President of the General Assembly visit conflict areas and see for themselves, and probably bring ideas back to the main hall of what is actually happening on the ground, so that they can influence the work of the Security Council, so that it's not only up to the Security Council to take decisions on peace and security. After all, that mandate belongs also, and more importantly, to the General Assembly. And so maybe what I'll do is, because I also believe very strongly that we have to have a good exchange of views, I'll stop there, Nick, and allow others to come in.
Thank you very much indeed. And Antonio and Carlos, this is for you as well, to underpin your remarks. Do you think, that there's actually a recognition of a growing, what I'm calling a frailty and vulnerability of the General Assembly? I mean, we just heard from Mr. Lajcak that, that in the end it's become a stiffer process, a much tighter, constrained process, apart from what he's introduced informally. But that question for all three of you, please, recognition of a growing frailty and vulnerability, because if you want to make it stronger, you must accept that there is a problem.
If you're to make the General Assembly stronger, is that what you meant, Nick?
But acceptance that actually there's a growing frailty and a challenge to its relevance and its capability.
Yes. I think this is a growing challenge to the frailty of all international institutions, if you ask me. Not just the General Assembly. In fact, given what has been said by the President of the General Assembly, the General Assembly probably delivered much more in this 1 year than many other institutions many other international institutions. So yes, there is frailty, but that's actually underpinned by that legitimacy, that credibility that the General Assembly has. But yes, there's frailty, I think, all around, and the reasons, I think, were told to us by those that were here in the first panel that we had, that in fact there is a tendency, I think, by the more powerful to ignore the virtues of multilateralism. And it's not just about the General Assembly, it's multilateralism in general.
Thank you, Amina. Let's move on to Antonio, please. And let's have a deal here. If there's something you really want to come in with very quickly, please put up your hand and let's get the microphone to you so we can move forward on a particular point if it's particularly related to what one of the speakers has said. Antonio.
Well, thank you very much, and let me start by congratulating the PGA for having put together this team that I think was a very worthwhile exercise, at least from my perspective. And I'll try to give a slightly different perspective from the one that your question implies. I actually believe that the General Assembly has enhanced its role over the past 10 or 15 years here at the United Nations, with new initiatives by presidents of the General Assembly, greater possibility for civil society to express itself, and with certain very innovative processes that have influenced other bodies that were not used to being influenced by the General Assembly. And I'm thinking in particular of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I remember very well as a Brazilian diplomatic official that 5, 7, 8 years ago, the people who dealt with G20 summits used to say, oh, whatever goes on at the UN is of very little concern to us. We don't even pay attention. Yet after the adoption of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, this was the first item on the G20 in Hangzhou in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. So, the finance ministry officials and the others who used to feel completely shielded from what was happening at the UN General Assembly suddenly were paying a lot of attention. I would also like to question a little bit your comment earlier, and you're in a position of being the moderator now, but you also were a panelist before, to the extent that those in the UN are conformists. I think that the UN is actually made up of idealists. And the 2030 Agenda, again, is an expression of a desire by a majority in the international community, but not by any measure a consensus when it began, to try to introduce the environmental variable into discussions on development. This was not a simple process. It was not linear. It involved a lot of dialectic discussion, a lot of resistance on the part of many ministries and agents around the world, and yet we managed to do this. Why? Because of a certain degree of idealism. And I think the same idealism is to be found, for example, in the way that a nuclear ban treaty was adopted by the General Assembly, which was a very interesting process because it started with civil society. Governments around the world, like-minded governments, embraced the cause. The Conference on Disarmament in Geneva was completely paralyzed, and lo and behold, the General Assembly is successful in producing a text which is not universally accepted, as we all know, but which won the Nobel Peace Prize and has, I think, sent a very strong message in terms of delegitimizing the possession of nuclear weapons. So I could go on with other examples. There are examples that PJ Lychak gave on climate change. The Paris Agreement itself, was to a certain extent the product of an initiative from the General Assembly. The more transparent procedures for electing Secretary Generals and now PGAs reflect also a capacity to renew and to look to the future. Now, having questioned the idea that the General Assembly is weak and unimaginative and lacks relevance internationally, I think there is one issue where the General Assembly has been a resounding failure, and that is in fulfilling its mandate to operate a Security Council expansion program. It's been going on for 25 years, and for some reason that is very difficult to pin down, a minority of countries are preventing the General Assembly for even having a text-based negotiation. Now, this is actually a procedural coup d'etat to some extent, because there is no veto in the General Assembly, and you operate by established majorities. And we would never have reached a 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, for example, if a minority of 25 countries had prevented text-based negotiations from advancing. Now, I'm not here defending a national position of X, Y, or Z format for a new Security Council. But what I am trying to denounce is the attempt on the part of some to introduce a procedural kind of filibustering into the General Assembly, which was not foreseen in the rules of procedure or should not be part of the General Assembly's culture. So here I think indeed we do have a challenge, because we were talking in the previous panel about geopolitical shifts and the way influence, diplomatic or economic or otherwise, is being distributed in new ways around the world. And this is not a process that will happen on its own to produce enhanced international cooperation. Now, if the UN is unable to respond to these changes in areas as vital as peace and security, and we know that the image and the reputation of the UN to a large extent rests on what it does or fails to do in peace and security, then I think we are heading for some trouble. Let me just conclude by two or three reflections on the global environment. First of all, I do not deny that we are facing a very challenging situation where powerful countries are resorting to unilateral action and withdrawing from multilateral processes. But I think, like others, it's important to note that this is not a new process. I think perhaps the most destabilizing unilateral decision taken during the 21st century was the decision to invade Iraq militarily. And this was not done by the current government. We're still living with the consequences of that. So in spite of this unilateral destabilizing activity, the UN went on to adopt the 2030 agenda, the nuclear ban. It didn't become paralyzed. It continued to work. And I believe that the UN can continue to work likewise, even in the face of these new tremendous challenges posed by unilateralism. Another point that I think is worth making, and this goes along the line of what Jean-Marie Guéhenno about creating new coalitions, I think we really need to unite all of us who see value in the UN and all of us who respect the basic tenets of the UN. Orders should belong to those who abide by the rules, not to the violators. So in that sense, I really question the idea that we're living in a Western-led international order or a such and such permanent member of the Security Council led international order. No, the order belongs to all of us who obey the rules, especially rules relating to the use of force and Chapter 7 rules. In this respect, I think we need to stick together more strongly, and not only as governments and as countries, but also as civil societies. I think the example of the nuclear ban really gave an extraordinary demonstration of how governments with civil societies can make a difference. I think of an organ such as the Commission on the Status of Women, which I chaired for 2 years, and the very idealistic and forward-looking agenda of that organ, how you could mobilize women internationally in favor of peace, in favor of fighting against weapons of mass destruction, and indeed in favor of reforms that will render the Security Council more equitable and more efficient. So, whereas I see problems and challenges for the future, I think that many important results have been achieved, not least of which the Global Compact on Migration, one of the most important challenges facing the world today. And President Lajčák was mentioning that it has been more difficult for the EU members in Brussels to find common ground and have a dialogue than for the 193 countries here in New York to reach a platform, even though there have been those who withdrew from the final results at some point in the process. So these are extraordinary strengths, and I think if we really continue to work in imaginative ways, drawing strength from the fact that it is a level playing field, that anything can be discussed, there's a flexibility. Even in the face of paralysis in the Security Council, there's a Uniting for Peace resolution that can afford a way out of paralysis, and it has been used, and perhaps it needs to be used more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to come in quickly on any of the detail there? But Antonio, let me just pick you up. Will this make a stronger General Assembly, or will it stop and prevent the organisation and the institution becoming weaker? In other words, does it become stronger by not becoming weaker in this current environment?
No, I think it is demonstrating strengths, but for it to continue to demonstrate strength, I think it needs leadership at national level, leadership at the PGA level, strong working relationship with the Secretary General, with the other organs, with civil society, with the private sector. It doesn't happen by miracle or by let's say, kind of a natural, spontaneous process. But certainly this past year, we've seen that kind of leadership, and I hope that the incoming PGA will continue this work and will continue the kind of discussions that we're having here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Carlos.
Thank you. I really want to add my voice in congratulating the PGA for this idea of having a team of advisors. We enjoyed the experience, and we hope it will continue with your successor. You gave us the opportunity also to frame some of the questions that are very difficult nowadays to deal with, and we just heard in the first panel some unnerving views and some dramatic insights that basically give the idea that we are in a world in a very fast transition, and as a result of that we are somehow disappointed that we are out of our comfort zone. That applies to multilateralism as it applies to many other areas. I want to bring the perspectives about the old, the current, and the future of multilateralism before zeroing in on some assessment of what I think is possible within the General Assembly. If we look into the history of multilateralism, we go all the way back to 1814 when the Congress of Vienna created what became known as the Concert of Europe, which was basically dealing with the Napoleonic Wars heritage. and created the impression that it was possible within Europe to create the mechanisms and the tools to deal with peace and maintain stability within a multilateral front. Then, as we know, it has been consolidated for a while, including with the Berlin Conference of 1884, before it collapsed. And collapsed completely, and it gave rise to the First World War. After the First World War, another attempt was made to try to do exactly the same with the League of Nations, which was basically within the Western region. There was already a presence that was more universal, but not completely universal. Most of the world then was colonized still. We know what happened to the League of Nations, and the aftermath of some of the discussions of trying to impede the rise of Germany end up in another war, the Second World War. And after that Second World War, again, another attempt. So we are in the third wave, which is the United Nations. Now, this third attempt is basically demonstrating symptoms that are very known from the previous two moments where there was a collapse of the multilateral front. And part of it has to do with the fact that we are still in a challenge of containment of power, and that challenge of containment of power is very difficult to stabilize and to preserve when there is, on the part of the main powers, a lack of interest in pursuing the multilateral front. So when they have unilateral agendas that become more important than their engagement in the multilateral front. And this has been, for all this time, mostly a Western construct that has been expanding. And the United Nations is by far the most universal attempt that we have had. And the engagement has been very genuine and congenial on the part of other parts of the world that became independent and wanted to be part of this family. So it is very difficult for us to accept that maybe we are entering into sort of the difficulties that we have seen before in the multilateral front, because now being so universal, we think it's not possible or it's very difficult to accept. And that brings us to the current reality. The current reality is one where the rhetoric of ambition is becoming way too high and distancing ourselves from what is really happening on the ground. And it's not very difficult to imagine that politicians in a number of countries are having difficulties because they raise expectations and then the populations feel they are hypocritical, they are not corresponding to the expectations they raise. And, the voices of what we call populism, normally we like to call populism things we don't understand, are, sort of taking the space. The same is happening somehow in the multilateral front. We are raising expectations to a level that is very difficult to deliver. I will give you some examples. The SDGs. The SDGs are basically calling for the end of poverty, leaving no one behind. And we are going to do this in 15 years. Is it really realistic? We know what finances are required for that to happen. From the first years of implementation of this agenda, what are the indications that this financing is materializing or rather is becoming more elusive? If we take into account the principles that underpin this agenda, which are a commensurate balance between three pillars, economic, social, and environmental, is this what really international policy is producing? Are we really witnessing the establishment of a more congenial agenda around three pillars? Or are we rather basically paying lip service to this balance? Because when you look into the Paris Agenda, just to give you an example on the climate front, what the Paris Agenda basically has produced is a number of commitments. There's no obligations that really are going to be transformative or even less disruptive in relation to the trends and in the incremental process that we have witnessed so far in the way we use energy, in the way we use fossil fuels, in the way we deal with carbon. So we have created this very high expectation. And then we are going to suffer the possibility that maybe it's not going to be realistic in terms of implementation. But there are other examples. And I think this is what really creates this impression that maybe the multilateralists, and I include myself in that group, obviously, have also taken, their wish list as the goalposts. And maybe this is going to distance themselves from the real actors on the ground. And then we have the future. The future is going to bring us some very disruptive developments. The most important for me is actually the demographic. We are talking about the technological and the climate at the same level as the demographic. But for me, the demographic is influencing quite significantly the other two. Because we are witnessing a level of tension rising, partly because of population aging, that is dismantling the ways we have dealt with distributive policies, including social security, pensions, and all the rest. So countries cannot afford the established, more comfortable policies that they have implemented for quite some time. And they are not keen on admitting that part of the reason is because of population aging. So the number of people benefiting from social protection being much larger than the number of people actually contributing. And as a result, debates about migration or any other aspect are becoming reasons for tensions that don't deal with the main problem. And the main problem is aging. Of course, if you look into technology, the implications are quite vast. Technology has two sides. One is the creation of the innovative ways of dealing with our modes of production. But the other dimension is actually the capacity to use the creation. You can have monopoly of creativity and innovation in some areas of the globe through intellectual property, through regimes that protect those who come first. But at the end of the day, technology is really for the younger generation. They are obviously the ones that are going to be able to absorb it more easily. And what we are going to witness in the world is with aging, we are going to have a high concentration of young people in some areas of the world, particularly Africa and to a large extent India. And this is going to be a completely novelty because until now, all demographic transitions have happened in completely different circumstances. Now we are going to witness such a demographic transition of incredible proportions at a time where the rest of the population is aging. Let me just give you one example of how far-reaching this can be. So if we accept that sustainable development goals and sustainable development is based on the principle of intergenerational solidarity, so we are preserving the planet, we are preserving the modes of production and the equilibrium of the planet and its distribution to the next generation. Imagine what is the expression of that intergenerational solidarity if most of the young people to whom you have to preserve these things for are not actually in your region, are going to be somewhere else. So it can no longer be exercised at the national level. It has to be exercised across the planet. So you'll have to have a relationship with Africa that is based on the fact that it's going to have the youngest population and about 2 in every 3 young people by the end of the century. Now, if you look just from the depth perspective, the entire depth of Africa right now is equivalent to the depth of Denmark, which is a country of less than 6 million people. And we consider it to be a disaster. And we are talking about 1.2 billion people. You can see how the system has become completely obsolete in relation to level of expectations and the reality on the ground. And this is the type of transitions that we are going to witness. We are going to have access to technology that is going to empower ways of working that are completely different from the ones we are used to. We are going to see the rise of China and other countries that are uncomfortable with the fact that multilateralism is not really being preserved because they have been benefiting from it. And we are going to see countries that right now appear very powerful, like Russia, having an incredible shrinking of their population. Japan also the same.
So, Carlos, can I interrupt, because you've given us a lot of points here, but what are the implications for the General Assembly?
Well, that's my concluding intervention. I think the General Assembly is doing the best under the circumstances. In fact, it's doing much more than others. And in my view, we are basically in an erosion of legitimacy of the multilateral system because of what I just described, whereas the General Assembly is still the only organ that can preserve that legitimacy. So its reinforcement is absolutely fundamental. And in doing some of the discussions, like the migration compact, in doing the discussions in a way that is structurally different in methodology from what it used to be, it's introducing ways of coping what is a very messy environment. And I think this rules-based principle is going to be challenged from different corners, but where it really sits is when you have a balance of power. And the only place that we still have preserved in terms of balance of power is actually the General Assembly. So we need to reinforce it, and I think some of the indications that the President of the General Assembly just gave us go in that direction. So it's, after all, about power balance, but the power balance in a world that is changing fast.
Thank you. I love that phrase, coping with a very messy environment. In other words, the General Assembly is doing pretty well. Thank you very much indeed. So don't get too worked up about it. Who would like to come in, please? Can we get the microphones? Where are the microphones, please? Here, and anyone else further back, please. And I'm wondering, President Lajcak, whether you might be able to just help us understand where you think reform of the Security Council has got to in terms of initiatives, but the limits of what can be done. If I could ask you to just give that a consideration in a moment, please. If you want to introduce yourself, please do, and there's someone at the back, please, as well.
Hello, yes. My name is Ram Chalori, and I'm with the International Peace Coalition in Princeton, New Jersey. I do not mean to be dwelling on failures of the UN, but I want to quote one, which is fairly quoted in the US, that being the Palestinian problem. It has been there for about 40 years. I assume majority of the UN members supported the Palestinian cause. In a similar sense, if I were to go back to this nuclear deal that was passed in the General Assembly, would it take another 50 years for that to be acted upon?
Who'd like to pick up on that? Antonio?
Well, briefly, I think an interesting development is probably going to happen this year is that Palestine will be the chair of the G77. And it will be interesting to see how that plays out, because there's no doubt it will give enhanced visibility to the plight of Palestine. But otherwise, I think there's also a big possibility for using the General Assembly through Uniting for Peace, through special emergency sessions. In fact, this year there were two, I understand, which is not very common to happen. One relating to the capital city of Israel, and the other to the situation in Gaza. So this might be a way for the future if, again, we don't succeed in reforming the Security Council and making it more receptive and more, let's say, treating equal situations equally, which is not happening right now.
But then you get the significant withdrawal of cash by the Americans from UNRWA.
Well, there are many countries in the region of Palestine that are not cash-strapped. I think, they can come in, and others can come in. In a sense, this is a voluntary contribution. The U.S. is entitled to do that. But I think all of those who are strongly committed to a Palestinian state will continue to find ways of supporting the cause. At least this is my expectation.
Amina, Carlos, on this one.
Well, I think that what Antonio has said is true. That I think the chairmanship of Palestine of the G77 will probably reveal much more than I can actually discuss right now. And then on UNRWA, again, I think that there's a very rich neighborhood, right? That should actually, come in and support the children of Palestine who will not be able to go to school and will not be able, right, to do the things that they have done for many years because of the withdrawal of these resources. So, I'm expecting, others to come in. The Europeans, I think, have already indicated that they would be supporting, UNRWA. And so, so we actually look forward to others coming in and doing what, the US has been doing.
Carlos?
I think.
Okay, sorry, big one.
Yeah. Carlos, come in.
One quick point. I think history matters, context matters. And this is a very good example of how you can actually have expectations that do not correspond to reality. So some of the most intractable difficulties that the UN has faced over time are basically trapped in the history of what these issues have been in the UN, but even before the UN, how they landed in the UN. And Palestine is very much a good example that demonstrates that history does matter, and we should be more careful in the way we expect the UN to solve some of the issues.
Let me keep driving you forward on a stronger General Assembly for a stronger United Nations, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Eleanor Openshaw. I work for the International Service for Human Rights. Quick comment and then a question, if I may. I think that safeguarding multilateralism will involve generating popular support for the system. And too often the General Assembly outputs result in no change for people's lives on the ground. We meet many people who understand that resolutions are produced, but the content of that resolution is never implemented. So I do believe that states need to look to that if you actually believe that multilateralism should mean something. My question relates to civil society. Often we hear states say very positive things about the participation of civil society, which is, of course, welcome. Unfortunately, all too often civil society is kept out of United Nations spaces. So my question to the panelists is, in your dream world, what would civil society engagement with the UN, and let's say the General Assembly as an example, what would that look like? Thank you.
Amina.
Yeah. Maybe the first question, because that was basically she was commenting, right? I don't think that we can continue with the business as usual, right? And I agree with you that we must speak up if we actually truly believe, as I do, and my colleagues do, in multilateralism, then we must speak up for multilateralism. We can't all be silent and then get up and blame those that are trying to disrupt the system in a negative way, and those that are pulling out of the system. So we really have to speak up for what we believe in, which is that multilateralism actually works and has worked for us. And yes, there have been hiccups here and there, but that is normal, even in our national settings, that you have hiccups.
Can I just pick you up? Speak up or stick up for multilateralism. It sounds a great principle, but the realities of politics now are meaning that that's an even more difficult thing. Speaking is one thing, but there are now maneuvers by so many countries, particularly, I don't have to name them, to actually weaken that multilateralism.
Well, I was in Geneva when the US withdrew from the Human Rights Council, and everybody else actually spoke up for the Human Rights Council and supported it. And I think we probably just need to do more of that. One moves out, 100 and something remain in there, and I think that's a larger number of voices than the one that has moved out. So we should do that, much more often. I think we all spoke up about the withdrawal of the of the US from the Human Rights Council, especially recognizing that the declaration was actually drafted right here in the US. And so I think we should speak up, much more than we're actually doing. We actually do that in Africa. We talk up multilateralism because we also truly believe, we all joined the UN voluntarily after, colonialism that wasn't terribly kind, to us, but we still believed in this system that would allow us to participate, to be included, right, and to sit at the decision-making table.
But do you think if you'd spoken louder before, say, the decision on the Human Rights Council, then Washington might have thought twice?
If we had all spoken up louder, I think if we had all spoken up louder and also shown, I think, the merits of belonging to the system.
So you've got to speak out louder much sooner, preemptively. Carlos and Antonio.
Well, we all come to the UN to make deals, and those deals have to have a structure for discussion. And I'm very much in favor, and that's the politically correct thing to say, that civil society organizations have to participate in as many discussions as possible, and that includes obviously the agenda of the General Assembly. But this being said, we need that structure to make that contribution really constructive and useful. Because you can have within civil society extreme views that will not be welcomed. So you have some sort of a filter that is required, which is what I'm calling structure, that brings on board what is really constructive and is going to help the collective move forward. So it's not just governments, but a much larger representation of views. This being said, I think the secret really is on methodologies. And I am very much in favor of new methodologies emerging for consultation. We have a very good example that is not used enough on the International Panel for Climate Change. It's not a coincidence that it also received the Nobel Prize. The way they worked is not really in conformity with the traditional ways of consulting in the UN. So it created a platform where scientists could be part of a much larger consultative process that then had to pass through a legitimization by governments. But before getting into governments, there was really a scientific process going with as many participants as necessary, required, and voluntary. So we have a very good example that new methodologies can be put in place. And we have to learn from some of the good experiences that already exist in the UN.
Antonio.
Yes, well, maybe to try to introduce another dimension. Of course, civil society has been playing an increasing role already, and many examples have been given through the nuclear test ban, for example, mobilizing governments around the world and reaching palpable results through the Commission on Status of Women, etc. But I think we should distinguish between civil society that is aligned with UN objectives and civil society which sometimes is not entirely aligned. And I think there's some very obvious examples. I mean, when we speak up for multilateralism, it's not multilateralism for its own sake. It's for the promotion of peace and stability, human rights, sustainable development. And yet there are gun lobbies, for example, that are part of civil society. They go in a different direction. Or you could even, within CSW, for example, on the status of women, there are very conservative groups that are also organized as civil society, and they're trying to prevent progress in, let's say, the majority, what the majority would like to see. This, I think, introduces a certain need for awareness of the complexities of the dialogue with civil society. I'm all in favor of enhancing the possibilities for interaction, and as chair of CSW, I try to do that with the civil society because I think by and large they are progressive, they're working in alignment with UN objectives, but also being careful to retain the intergovernmental nature of the organization, which is ultimately the way that societies will come to change laws and adapt and align themselves with many of the objectives of civil society. And one of the aspects of the SDG, the Sustainable Development Agenda, that we fought for including as Brazil, and I'm glad that much of the language does include this, is the idea that you're not only supposed to abide by existing laws. In many cases, you should try to change legislation, whether it's on gender equality, whether it's on education or other issues. And this is where also civil society can help governments to implement those changes. It's not only through activity in the corridors of the United Nations or by lobbying here at the UN. Thank you.
President Lajczak, can I come to the Security Council issue? Can you help us understand where you think it's got to on the technicalities? There does seem to be this sort of sense of a lot of mud. Things have got stuck. Can you help us understand a little bit for those who are not following every single minutiae of this issue?
I've said several times that the General Assembly is the most representative organ, and that's true. And this cannot be said about the Security Council, because it is widely recognized that the Security Council reflects the realities of 1945. And as the world is changing, for all the international organs to stay relevant, they should also evolve. And this has not been contested. There is an understanding that the Security Council should, in its composition, be more reflecting of today's realities and the shifts in balance of power. But there are then very different views when it comes to how many members the new council should have, what should be the status, the full permanent membership with veto powers or permanent membership without veto powers, extended membership. So there are logical questions that are being discussed. And then there are a group of countries who believe that, as Antonio put it, that similar to other UN processes, the text should be presented and the negotiations should continue on the basis of the text. Well, there is another group of countries who believe that it would be premature to put a text on table because we need more time to engage and to clarify these basic issues, and that tabling the text could actually be disruptive to this process. Both schools of thought are legitimate. What is important is that the one school of thought is not trying to suppress the other. And this is exactly why I called at the beginning of this session for two things: credible process and meaningful outcome. Credible process means a genuine discussion about these complex issues, the process that every member state can believe in and know that this is the process. It's not a proxy exercise, it's a real process when these issues are discussed. And I do believe that we got a credible process. Meaningful outcome is the outcome that when you look back, you see that we've moved the process forward. And this is obviously for member states to judge how meaningful the outcome was, but the fact is that the result of our work this year was adopted by consensus by the member states. So it's a long journey, but it's very, very important, because the fact is that the entire huge work of the United Nations is seen and judged in the first place by the performance of the Security Council. And I've traveled around the world, I've had many meetings with people in many countries, and UN unjustly gets lots of criticism simply because of the situations when the Security Council is stuck and is unable to agree on important issues. And look, in this 70-second session, I'll give you two examples that show how powerful the Security Council is when it can agree. DPRK, North Korean issue. The Security Council was united repeatedly, and it brought about significant change. And also the issue of Myanmar, where we had the unity, and as a result, there were important shifts in addressing the tragedy of Rohingya people. Of course, there are moments where the Security Council was unable to act in unanimity, and then obviously was criticized, and unjustly also the rest of the great work the United Nations is doing.
Thank you very much. We've got 15 minutes. We're not going to resolve the Security Council issue, but let me ask you to dig into your resources of initiative and insight here, all three of you. How can we take this forward? Is there something, you have the luxury of not having to negotiate this, but is there something which could be a real kind of nirvana type of moment where this could suddenly produce something different? All three of you, Amina.
I come from a continent that is totally not represented in the Security Council, at least not in the permanent membership. It's a temporary member for 2 years from time to time, but even as a non-permanent member, it's not allowed to fully participate in the debates, the discussions, the decisions that are made in the Security Council. So yes, I totally would like to see the reform of the Security Council to include those from the continent whose issues are discussed day in, day out. In fact, they always, almost continuously form 70% of the agenda of the Security Council now. If that happened in the 50s, that would still be understood because we were colonies. We're no longer colonies. We demand a place at the table. We will only get that place if the Security Council is reformed. At the moment, we are obligated to carry out its decisions and execute them and adhere to them. And yet we actually have absolutely no participation in them. So
Can
we
you
think,
see a way of breaking that down?
well, the reforms must move forward. I don't agree with this whole issue of rejecting negotiations from proceeding. And this has been going on. I was here in the 90s, and this discussion was ongoing. It's still ongoing. I don't know how it's going to be broken, but I think maybe one way is for the rest of us to actually reject to implement the decisions of the Security Council, so that there's an understanding that we too want to fully participate in the deliberations and in the discussions in the Council. I don't know how democratic it is to force me to implement a resolution that I had absolutely nothing to do with, and that I may not even agree with. Iraq has been mentioned, but there are many others. There's Libya, the things that happen on our own continent, where the decisions that we had made were completely ignored. The wisdom that we were bringing to the table was completely ignored, and yet in the end, what happened was that it was proven right. So we want a place at the table. The only way we can get that place is through the reform of the Security Council. And I think, especially now, given what Carlos said about the demographics, it becomes even much more urgent to ensure that the reform of the Security Council is carried out. That, in a way, also, Nick, would ensure that the GA gets strengthened if we reform the Security Council in a way that gives all of us a voice.
Antonio, you have the luxury of being a leading diplomat still serving, who can then find his way, or on behalf of your government, a way through things like this. Is there a magical kind of patriota way forward which is yet to be adopted, which you can help us understand?
I won't speak on behalf of my government here, but as an advisor to the President of the General Assembly, and with all due respect to his efforts over the past year, I think, and having participated in the exercise in the IGN, I think it's going nowhere, honestly. And the progress is so incremental that it becomes actually non-existent, because you don't start the following year from a higher level of ambition. You just see the same countries trying to torpedo the whole process. So I would humbly submit that maybe the IGN has outlived its usefulness and it's time to declare it concluded, and encourage countries to present a draft resolution in the General Assembly. Now, there's this anxiety about, will we obtain two-thirds majority, will we not? I think the test is worth trying. If two-thirds majority is not obtained, try again next year, then the following year, and continue with an inclusive process. For many countries that were not original UN founding members, the process for becoming a member was a very difficult one that required a series of votes until they succeeded. And this did not detract them from trying again until they succeeded. So I think similarly, also drawing inspiration from 1964, which is the only time when the Security Council expanded, arguably only in the non-permanent category, which is perhaps more simple than what we're aiming for now. There wasn't a consensus. In fact, the permanent members, they voted against or abstained in the General Assembly, but subsequently ratified the amendment. So I think there's a lot to be said for saying, well, it's been an excellent exercise and everybody has had ample opportunity to expose their views. But I think action is what is required because it may be too late. You know, you were talking about outsourcing to the China bank when the IMF doesn't deliver. You know, NATO is starting to assume responsibilities that were not foreseen in the charter out of area and rivaling to some degree the responsibilities that should be assigned to the charter exclusively. So I think we need to do this very quickly before we regret not having...
And who do you think might engineer all of this?
An imaginative diplomacy.
By whom? Led by whom?
I wouldn't name any country, but
well,
you know, there's a lot of imagination all over the world.
You're among friends here. Tell us.
Honestly, it could be a coalition of countries. You know, when you look, it could be a group of small countries. I'm a big defender of the sovereign equality of states because I saw what small island states were capable of achieving in Paris for the Paris Agreement. I've seen, for example, what St. Vincent and the Grenadines has done as a coordinator for a common platform for Security Council reform. So why not St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for example, take up this challenge and present on behalf of a group of like-minded, a coalition that includes African countries, Latin American, and others, and maybe start to
Shall I just check, is there anyone here from St. Vincent and the Grenadines who wants to take up this challenge?
If the permanent representative were here, I'm sure she would rise up and say, I'm ready to do it.
Carlos.
I'm very much of the view, like Antonio, that we have not yet tested the pudding. We keep talking about reform of the Security Council without admitting that all you need is 2/3 majority in the General Assembly to pass the first stage of that process. That has never been tested. If it was tested, then the second stage would be probably a very different discussion from what we have right now, where some of the countries that may not like such a reform will find it very difficult if there was an overwhelming support in the first stage. Because we never tested, we don't know. So it's very easy to actually blame the powerful countries for not wanting reform, which, you know, is sort of an expeditious way of dealing with the issue, when in fact there's some hard work to do on the part of all others that want to do a reform of the Security Council to actually test their ideas in the General Assembly, including Africa. If Africa really wants to put forward a very strong proposal that is commensurate to its ambitions, then it has to test it in the General Assembly. You know, that's what China did, and they got it.
I mean,
so it's absolutely possible to go that route. It's not necessarily easy, and it's not necessarily successful, but that's the way to go.
I mean,
the C10 tried it last year to put a draft through, and they didn't have the support. The C10 are African countries that have been mandated by the African Union to push the Security Council reform agenda, and they didn't get the support that they needed from other countries. So maybe it's something that the Africans could try again.
Right. I want to invite anyone who's got a really big idea. You've got the President of the General Assembly here. If you want to get a really big idea of how to make the United Nations stronger, now is your big moment. Please, do you have the microphone? I'm not sure this is what you want to do to give us a great idea. And did I see another hand go up there too? Yeah, okay. We've got 5 minutes to run, so be brief.
Okay, so as you know, this is being streamed on Facebook. We have nearly a dozen comments representing indigenous people of Biafra, and I don't know if this forum can address this issue, but they just want to draw attention to the situation in the country and the persecution of Christians, and they're asking whether the United Nations can do something about this. A second question was about the Uniting for Peace resolution. Would the General Assembly see this as an opportunity when the Security Council cannot take action? Will they utilize this historic option that has been used in the past?
Thank you. I don't think we're going to get answers there about stronger United Nations, but I think it's tremendous that you're getting those kind of comments from places like Biafra and places like in something like this. The fact that they can communicate directly without any mediation or curating. Does anyone want to come in? Because there's another question over there. You've got the microphone? Yeah, thank you. Then I'm going to go to President Lajcak as well.
Yes, thank you. This is going to be clearly a case of exceeding expectation or whatever. No, thank you very much. Narges Saidan, I'm the representative for the International Organization of La Francophonie to the UN, and I just had very quickly 3 points to raise and maybe have your views on. One is because this is a case of every state being equal or all states being equal within the General Assembly, I think there is a need to really look at the issue of the capacities of member states to engage. We have member states to the UN that have missions of 3 people with an additional language barrier when they communicate with their capitals to engage fully in the discussions, and I think that is something that needs to be looked at in a different manner. The other aspect is one of technicity, and I think that meets a bit the previous discussion we have both on conformity and the technical capacity, and there I think the General Assembly could very ably engage with not only regional organizations but also linguistic organizations and other organizations that are that are present at the UN in helping these technical discussions happen to support the engagement of member states, because what we see is very often that our member state representatives and our member states in general are completely overwhelmed by the complexity of the discussions, the number of meetings, and the whole processes that are there. So, and my last question maybe would be if you have any ideas on, because what we're talking about is really basically a drastic change in the system, and linking up to what Mr. Going was also saying in the previous panel, how do we actually address the fact that most of the unblocking of the situation happens outside and outside the limits of instructions from the capital? I mean, there is a real need to look at that. So I would like your
Thank you.
feedback.
Quickly, particularly that issue of capacity of member states to engage.
Yeah, well, it's a real issue. It's a real issue. We have raised it on several occasions and even requested that fewer issues be dealt with by the General Assembly on a yearly basis. Take up 5 issues and deal with them this year, and then take up any other issues that come up the year after. I mean, it's not received the support that it should, right? And I think maybe it's because, and I'm sorry to say this, but most of the powerful states have thousands of people at their disposal at any given time, at headquarters in New York, probably in Geneva as well. Mm-hmm. And so, they don't actually feel the pain of not being able to represent, your government, your country in all these all these sessions. It's only the wearer.
Time is pressing here.
It's only the wearer who knows, where the shoe pinches. So I would support that call that we continue pressing for fewer issues to be discussed at the General Assembly, so that we can all participate as effectively as we must.
Thank you. Do you mind if I stop you because of timing? But Antonio and Carlos, is there anything you want to add to those very pragmatic points?
Well, actually, I wanted to say just one word about Biafra by saying that managing diversity is really a challenge, not just in Africa, but everywhere. And I think it's very important for us to do much more in terms of managing diversity and accepting expressions that are not in conformity with the majority. And this is one of the areas where democracy has been really failing. And Jean-Marie Guénaud was just mentioning in the first panel that democracy should not just be about elections, and electing leaders. It's about this whole range of values and systems that includes managing diversity properly. On the issues that were raised, I wanted just to pick on the language one. I think the language is an area where the developments of technology are going to be fast and furious. algorithms and artificial intelligence are going to be able to translate everything in just real time. It's already happening. If you go to China and you try to buy something, the shopkeeper is going to give you in a tablet for you to talk to the shop to the tablet, and then it translates into English. But more importantly, Google Translator or whatever platforms you use are perfectioning translation in such a speed that is going to be possible actually to do most of the operations across the world with the translation done artificially. So I'm afraid that after the printing shops in the UN that got out of the job and created lots of problems for management, the next stage is going to be translators maybe will be out of the job.
Will algorithms make policies clearer too?
Well, hopefully the algorithms can help.
Antonio, quickly, any point you want to pick up? Then I'll go to President Lajcak.
Just to acknowledge that this is a serious matter for small delegations. I realize that Brazil, for example, has 24 diplomats here and has a lot of trouble keeping up with everything that's going on. The official 24. It's our biggest diplomatic mission or embassy in the world, given the load of work here. So obviously for smaller countries. But I see smaller countries engaging very intelligently through groups, whether it's CARICOM or Small Island Developing Nations or the South Pacific Forum, etc. These maximize the possibility for intervening. And when you speak of engaging, I think of at least two modalities. One is to propose ideas and to advance new initiatives. This is more difficult, and I think here you may need assistance from, for example, civil society, academia, NGOs. Another way of engaging is by saying no to ideas that seem to be irrational or not in conformity with the UN objectives or detrimental to your own country. And in this sense, I think it's just a simple telephone can work wonders with good arguments. You will engage very effectively, believe me. And I see many engaging very effectively in saying no to bad ideas.
President Lajcak, let me ask you to take the floor, particularly on that point about whether much of the ambition for the General Assembly is constrained by these very critical limitations at a time of so much complexity now. And can I just add my voice of gratitude for being invited to be part of your external advisory group. We worked incredibly hard and easy for me to say, but it really was tough discussion. It's not somewhere where we just went for dinner and had a nice time. It was actually something which was an engine room, and an engine room free from the pressures of capital. So thank you very much indeed. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your vivid interest in the subjects discussed. I would also like to briefly react to the questions that were asked at the beginning. On the Uniting for Peace initiative, this is an instrument that allows the General Assembly to take up issues that the Security Council is unable to agree on, and this has been used twice during this 72nd session. The good thing about this is that the it really puts a positive pressure on the Security Council. That means they cannot drag on forever with the issues, because then somebody else will deal with it. But I would never like to see this instrument as something that is putting General Assembly against the Security Council. This would be very detrimental to the organization. On an issue about the small delegations, this was one of the topics discussed in our morning dialogues, and permanent representatives came up with a number of very good and constructive suggestions. Obviously, we are trying not to multiply meetings that are taking place at the same time, better structure the work of the organization. The problem is that the same delegations are then in formal meetings proposing other meetings. So I also said half-jokingly that we need to build the bridge between the PRs in the morning dialogues and the PRs in formal sessions, so that they don't contradict themselves. And the unblocking of the issues where we are stuck, departing from the instructions from the capitals, I think this is the beauty of the United Nations. The fact is that every member state comes with national positions, with the red lines, but through the daily interaction among the diplomats, permanent representatives, you also grow your awareness of the joint mission, which is, to protect the peace, to develop this planet, and to defend the human rights of people. And it's the beauty of diplomacy and the virtue of the diplomats, the top diplomats who are representing their countries here, that they can still respect their headquarters instructions and yet reach a compromise where no one is losing and we are all winning. And this is what the United Nations is about. And I really believe that this discussion today proved once again that we need United Nations more than ever before. I want to thank my advisors for an excellent job, not only this morning, but throughout the year, for a very strong support I've received from them. Being the PGA is not my first multilateral experience, and I know that international organizations have the tendency to lock themselves in a bubble. You develop different language, you deal with issues, and you are slowly losing contact with the real world. So you helped me to pop that bubble and to make sure that we are still talking real issues, and I'm very grateful for that. Second, a report was mentioned here, and I'm again very grateful to my advisors that they put together their report. It's their report on the issues that we have been discussing and we have dealt with. The report is available, the hard copies are here, you can take them. The electronic version will be put on my website, on the PGA's website after this event. The report is addressing issues such as the state of the United Nations and the multilateral affairs, peace and prevention, role of the Security Council and the General Assembly, and other issues such as migration, financing for development. So when I said at the beginning, we have to think boldly and we have to think out of the box, this report is exactly an example of this. And my final point is something that Carlos Lopez alluded to. There is a pattern in history. Every time human civilization brought itself on the verge of a catastrophe, then we created a system that would prevent us from repeating the same stupidity in the future. So we created Concert of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, we've created League of Nations after the World War I, and we have created United Nations after the World War II. So now we see, and it was very clear from this discussion, that there are warning lights flashing, and the multilateralism is under threat, there is an erosion. So the question is, do we need another catastrophe to understand that there is no better protection for this civilization than a rules-based system using the multilateral organizations? And I hope that we have to talk about it to avoid the worst. And this meeting today was, I believe, a very important contribution to our discussion. So thank you once again for being part of it, and thanks to IPI for hosting this event. Thank you very much.